Stalin sits silently in his office. He's been working for 12 hours straight, annotating reports, making lists, deciding fates. A secretary brings him a document listing names of party members accused of conspiracy. Stalin reads through it slowly, meticulously. Next to some names, he writes, beat. Next to others, isolate and preserve. Next to others still, he simply makes a checkmark. Each checkmark is a death sentence. Stalin will sign dozens of these tonight. Then he'll go watch a movie at his private cinema, maybe an American Western. Then he'll host a dinner party where terrified officials will drink and laugh at his jokes until dawn. This was routine. This was just another night. We think we know Joseph Stalin, the dictator, the tyrant, the man responsible for millions of deaths. But what was he actually like as a person? Not in the abstract sense of evil dictator, but in the specific, day-to-day reality of his personality. What did people experience when they were in a room with him? What drove him? What did he think about? How did his mind work? Today we're examining Stalin's personality in detail, his paranoia, his cruelty, his strange humor, his work habits, his relationships, his complete lack of empathy. Not to humanize him or excuse anything, but because understanding how someone like Stalin actually functioned as a person tells us something crucial about how totalitarianism works. Stalin's most defining characteristic was paranoia so extreme, so all-consuming, that it shaped every aspect of his personality and rule. This wasn't occasional suspicion, this was his default mode of seeing the world. Stalin genuinely believed enemies surrounded him constantly. Every colleague was a potential traitor. Every foreign power was plotting invasion. Every piece of bad news was evidence of sabotage. Every failure meant someone had deliberately undermined him, and here's what made it effective: sometimes he was right. People did plot against him, of course they did. He was a murderous tyrant. So his paranoia became self-reinforcing. The fact that real conspiracies existed justified his belief in imaginary ones. But Stalin's paranoia went beyond rational suspicion. He saw patterns that didn't exist, connections that weren't there. If two officials talked privately, they must be plotting. If someone seemed nervous in his presence, they must be hiding something. If crops failed, it must be sabotage rather than bad weather or poor policy. This paranoia made him exhausting to be around. People in his presence were constantly monitored for signs of disloyalty. Did you hesitate before drinking when Stalin proposed a toast? Suspicious. Did you laugh too hard at his jokes? You're mocking him. Not hard enough? You don't respect him. Nikita Khrushchev, who survived Stalin's inner circle, described it as psychological torture. You could never relax, never be natural, because Stalin was always watching, always testing, always suspicious. Stalin appears to have had virtually no capacity for empathy. This wasn't just cruelty. Many cruel people can still understand others' feelings even if they don't care. Stalin seems to have genuinely not understood emotional connection. He could calculate how people would react out of fear or ambition. He was brilliant at that. But he couldn't grasp why someone would act out of love, loyalty, or compassion. These emotions were alien to him, so he assumed everyone else was as calculating and self-interested as he was. This shows in how he treated his own family. When his first wife died, witnesses reported he said something like, "She's dead and with her have died my last warm feelings for people." Whether he actually said this or not, it captures something true. Stalin related to people as objects, tools, or threats, not as humans with inner lives. His son Yakov tried to shoot himself after Stalin berated him. Stalin mocked him for failing. When Yakov was captured by Germans in World War II and they offered to exchange him, Stalin refused, saying, "I have no son named Yakov." Yakov died in a German POW camp. Think about that. Stalin chose to let his own son die in captivity rather than appear weak by negotiating. That's not just ruthlessness, that's a fundamental inability to feel what fathers normally feel for sons. Contrasting with his paranoia was Stalin's extraordinary patience. He could wait years to settle a score. He could play the long game better than almost anyone in history. When rivals seemed too powerful to attack directly, Stalin would wait, building his position, creating dependencies, until the moment was right. Then he'd strike, often years after the initial offense. This patience made him terrifying. You could cross Stalin, think you'd gotten away with it, relax, and then 5 years later, you'd be arrested. He forgot nothing, forgave nothing, and had all the time in the world, but this patience wasn't wise or strategic in the larger sense, it was in service of his paranoia. Stalin patiently built cases against imaginary conspirators, waited for the right moment to purge loyal subordinates, carefully planned terror campaigns. His patience made his cruelty more effective, not less. Stalin needed to control everything and everyone around him. This went far beyond what was strategically necessary. It was psychological compulsion. He micromanaged absurdly. He'd personally approve which writers could be published, which films could be shown, which operas could be performed. He'd edit poetry and suggest plot changes to novels. He'd involve himself in decisions about factory management hundreds of miles away. Why? Partly because he was smart and saw implications others missed. But mainly because Stalin could not tolerate anything happening without his approval. Loss of control felt like existential threat. This extended to people's thoughts. Stalin didn't just want obedience, he wanted people to genuinely believe his propaganda. To internalize his worldview. The show trials weren't just about eliminating enemies, they were about forcing confessions, making people admit they'd been wrong and Stalin was right. Control over reality itself, that was Stalin's goal. And to a terrifying degree, he achieved it. Stalin had an extraordinary memory. He could recall details from conversations years earlier, remember who'd said what at which meeting, quote from books he'd read decades before. This made him formidable in arguments and discussions. He'd cite obscure facts, remember previous positions people had taken, catch contradictions. Nobody could bluff Stalin. He knew too much, remembered too much, but he also used this memory for grudges. He remembered every slight, every moment someone had doubted him, every time someone had been less than enthusiastic about his ideas. Years later, he'd bring it up, often just before having that person arrested. People who worked with Stalin described the unnerving experience of him remembering trivial details from years ago, except the details were never trivial to Stalin. Everything was data in his mental filing system of who was reliable and who was suspect. Stalin's daily routine was deliberately disorienting. He'd sleep until noon or later, then work through the night until 4 or 5 a.m. This wasn't natural for him, it was strategic. By keeping these hours, Stalin forced his subordinates to be available at all times. You might get a phone call at 2 a.m. demanding your presence. Meetings would run until dawn. Officials had to remain constantly ready to be summoned, disrupting any normal life or sleep schedule. This kept everyone exhausted and off balance. Sleep-deprived people make worse decisions, are more emotionally vulnerable, are easier to manipulate. Stalin, who slept when he wanted, maintained control while everyone else stumbled through in a fog of exhaustion. His office would fill with officials late at night, waiting to be called in, never knowing when or why. Sometimes Stalin would make them wait hours, then send them home without seeing them. The message, your time isn't your own. You exist at Stalin's convenience. Stalin's dinners at his dacha outside Moscow were legendary exercises in psychological torture disguised as hospitality. He'd invite officials, meaning command them to attend. The dinners would start late, often 10 p.m. or later, and last until 5 or 6 a.m. There would be endless courses of Georgian food that Stalin himself barely touched. And there would be drinking. Constant, enforced drinking. Stalin would propose toast after toast, and everyone had to drink. He'd watch carefully to see who drank enthusiastically, who hesitated, who tried to avoid drinking. He'd sometimes water down his own drinks while forcing others to drink straight vodka. He was testing, always testing. The atmosphere was bizarre. Stalin would tell jokes and everyone would laugh hysterically. He'd sing Georgian songs and everyone would join in. He'd be charming and avuncular, then suddenly his mood would shift and he'd make a cutting remark or veiled threat. The temperature of the room would change instantly. Khrushchev described feeling like he was on trial at these dinners, never knowing if Stalin's jovial mood would turn murderous. Sometimes Stalin would make officials dance for his amusement, grown men performing like trained animals while Stalin watched and laughed. Molotov, one of Stalin's closest associates, attended thousands of these dinners over decades. His wife was arrested and sent to the Gulag. Yet Molotov still came to dinner and laughed at Stalin's jokes. That was the level of control Stalin exercised. You'd smile and drink with the man who destroyed your family. In meetings and conversations, Stalin had a distinctive interrogation method. He wouldn't directly accuse or attack initially. Instead, he'd ask questions. Probing, detailed questions that seemed casual but were actually traps. He would ask simple questions such as, "How is your work going at the ministry?" But your answer would be analyzed for hidden meanings. If you said things were good, you were hiding problems. If you admitted problems, you were admitting incompetence. There was no safe answer. Stalin would ask about specific details, production numbers, personnel decisions, minor administrative matters. If you didn't know the answer, you were unprepared and unreliable. If you knew too much, you were suspiciously overinterested in that area. The goal was to keep people defensive and uncertain. Nobody could relax around Stalin because any conversation could become an interrogation, and any answer could be used against you later. One of Stalin's stranger habits was his compulsive editing of documents. He'd read reports, speeches, articles, even poetry and novels, and annotate them heavily in the margins. Sometimes his edits were substantive, changing policy details, correcting what he saw as errors. But often they were stylistic or even petty, changing word choices, criticizing phrasing, showing that he knew better than the writer. This served multiple purposes. It demonstrated his control over information and culture. It showed he was paying attention to everything. And it fed his ego. Stalin could prove he was smarter than everyone else by improving their work, but it also revealed something about his personality. Stalin couldn't read anything passively. He had to interact with it, dominate it, reshape it to his will. Even reading was an act of control. Stalin had distinctive physical traits and mannerisms that people remembered vividly. He was short, about 5 feet 5 inches or 5 feet 6 inches, and self-conscious about it. He'd wear boots with built-up heels and often stood on small platforms during photos. His left arm was noticeably shorter than his right and less mobile, from a childhood injury or infection. He was sensitive about this and positioned himself carefully in photos to hide it. He had a pockmarked face from childhood smallpox. His teeth were bad and yellowed from his pipe. He smoked constantly, usually a pipe rather than cigarettes, and the pipe became part of his image. His eyes were particularly notable. Multiple people described them as yellow or amber-colored. Cold and reptilian. They described the unnerving experience of Stalin looking at you. He wouldn't blink, just stare with those cold eyes, and you'd feel like he was dissecting you mentally. He moved deliberately, spoke slowly and quietly. His voice was described as soft but somehow menacing. He didn't gesticulate much when speaking. Everything about his physical presence was controlled, measured, designed to project authority while revealing nothing. Stalin had a sense of humor, but it was cruel and sadistic. He'd make jokes about people he was about to have arrested. He'd mock subordinates to their faces. He'd find genuine amusement in others' fear and discomfort. At one dinner, he supposedly put a tomato on someone's chair, waited for them to sit on it, then laughed at their embarrassment. Childish, except this was from a man who could have that person shot if he wanted. The joke was also a reminder of power. I can humiliate you and you have to laugh along. He'd make dark jokes about executions and the gulag. You say X is guilty? Then what are you waiting for? Give him a tie. Meaning a noose. Then he'd watch to see who laughed and how enthusiastically they laughed. The humor served a purpose beyond entertainment. It tested loyalty. Would you laugh at jokes about murdering your colleagues? It normalized violence. If we're joking about it, it can't be that serious. And it demonstrated Stalin's absolute power. He could make death funny because he controlled it absolutely. Stalin's relationships with his closest associates followed a predictable pattern: initial favor, growing suspicion, eventual destruction. Nobody stayed in his inner circle forever. They either died or were purged, but while you were in favor, Stalin could be surprisingly warm. He'd ask about your family, remember your birthday, give you gifts. He'd use Georgian terms of endearment, share meals, seem like a friend. This made the betrayal worse. People like Bukharin, who'd known Stalin for decades, who'd been his friend, couldn't believe Stalin would have them killed. Even as they were being arrested, they'd think there must be some mistake, that Stalin didn't know what was happening. But Stalin knew. He'd personally signed the execution orders. The warmth had all been performance. Stalin didn't have friends, he had tools that were temporarily useful. Molotov survived the longest in Stalin's inner circle, from the 1920s to Stalin's death in 1953. But even Molotov lived in constant fear. His wife was arrested and imprisoned, and Molotov still had to show up at Stalin's dinners and pretend everything was fine. That was the price of survival, complete submission, no matter what Stalin did to you or your family. Stalin married twice. His first wife, Ekaterina Kato-Svanidze, died young in 1907 of typhus or tuberculosis. By various accounts, Stalin was genuinely devastated. There's a famous anecdote of him at her funeral saying something about her being his last connection to human warmth. Whether he actually felt this or not, his behavior suggests Cato's death did something to him. He became harder, colder afterward. Or perhaps he just used her death as an excuse for the coldness that was already there. His second wife, Nadezhda Nadia Alliluyeva, shot herself in 1932 after a fight with Stalin at a dinner party. She'd been increasingly horrified by what Stalin was doing, the famine his policies caused. The arrests, the terror. Stalin was brutal to her verbally, dismissive and contemptuous. After her suicide, Stalin refused to attend her funeral. He never fully acknowledged it was suicide. The official story was cerebral hemorrhage. He kept her room exactly as it was, like a shrine, but he also seemed angry at her for dying, as if she betrayed him by escaping his control. His relationships with women reveal his inability to see other people as independent beings. Women were either possessions to be controlled or threats to be neutralized. Love, partnership, mutual respect, these concepts seemed foreign to him. Stalin's relationships with his children were toxic and tell us much about his personality. His oldest son Yakov, from his first marriage, bore the brunt of Stalin's contempt. When Yakov's first marriage failed, Stalin berated him so severely that Yakov tried to shoot himself. He survived, and Stalin reportedly mocked him that he couldn't even shoot straight. Think about that response. Your son attempts suicide because of you, and your reaction is mockery. That's not just cruel, it's a complete absence of normal human emotion. Stalin's daughter Svetlana later wrote that her father broke her life. He controlled who she could see, interfered in her relationships, used her as a pawn. When she eventually defected to the United States in 1967, she described growing up in an atmosphere of fear and control. His son Vasily became an alcoholic and a bully, given positions he didn't deserve because of his father's name, then discarded and left to drink himself to death after Stalin died. Stalin didn't just fail as a father, he actively damaged his children. They were objects to him, extensions of himself, not independent people deserving of love or respect. Stalin didn't seem capable of reciprocal relationships. Every interaction was transactional. People were useful or not useful, loyal or disloyal, tools or threats. This is why he could have old friends executed without apparent emotion. The friendship had never been real to him, it had been a temporary alignment of interests. When that alignment ended, so did the friendship. People who worked with Stalin described a chilling quality. He'd be engaged and focused when you were discussing something he cared about, but if the topic stopped being useful to him, it was like a light switched off. You'd stop existing to him mid-conversation. This inability to connect genuinely with other humans was perhaps Stalin's most fundamental personality trait. It enabled all his other cruelties because people simply weren't real to him in the way they are to most of us. Stalin built an elaborate cult of personality around himself, but interestingly, he seemed to partly believe his own propaganda. Cities were renamed after him. His image was everywhere. Poems were written praising him. He was called Father of the Peoples, Genius of Mankind, Greatest Genius of all times and peoples. The propaganda was absurd and over the top, but Stalin apparently needed this. Despite his power, despite having crushed all opposition, he still needed constant validation. The praise had to keep coming, the adulation had to be performed, or you became suspect. This reveals deep insecurity beneath the ruthless exterior. Stalin needed to be told he was a genius, needed to be praised and worshipped, needed reality itself to confirm his specialness. The paranoid tyrant was also an insecure man desperate for validation. Stalin was genuinely intelligent, though not the genius his propaganda claimed. He was well-read, particularly in Russian history and Marxist theory. He could grasp complex issues quickly and remember details extensively, but his intelligence was narrow and rigid. He was good at certain types of thinking, strategic manipulation, organizational control, detecting threats and weaknesses. He was less good at creative thinking, adapting to new situations, or understanding complexity that didn't fit his ideological framework. His writing was pedestrian and derivative. His theoretical contributions to Marxism were minimal. When he did write, it was often paranoid and dogmatic. His genius was largely enforced through propaganda and the execution of anyone who might outshine him. Stalin made decisions slowly and methodically when it came to large policy matters, but could be impulsive and vindictive in personal matters. For major decisions, he'd gather information obsessively, consult advisors, study historical precedents. He'd play different factions against each other to see all sides. Then he'd decide, and once decided, the decision was unchangeable regardless of consequences. This combination, thorough preparation followed by rigid inflexibility, led to catastrophic policies. The forced collectivization that caused famine was carefully planned, systematically implemented, and continued despite overwhelming evidence it was causing mass death. Stalin wouldn't admit error or change course. For personal decisions, who to arrest, who to promote, who to execute, Stalin could be impulsive. A chance remark might doom someone. A moment of displeasure could end a career. The randomness was partly strategic, keeping everyone afraid, and partly Stalin's genuine volatility. Stalin claimed to be a committed Marxist-Leninist, but he was actually quite pragmatic when ideology conflicted with power. He'd cite Marx and Lenin constantly, but he'd also distort their ideas to justify whatever he wanted to do. When ideology was useful, he wielded it. When it was inconvenient, he ignored it or reinterpreted it. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939 is a perfect example. Ideologically, this made no sense. Nazis were the ultimate enemy of communism. But pragmatically, it gave Stalin time to prepare for eventual war and divided Eastern Europe between Germany and the USSR. So Stalin signed it, and Soviet propaganda suddenly stopped criticizing Nazis. Stalin's true ideology was power. Everything else, Marxism, socialism, Soviet patriotism, were tools to achieve and maintain control. As Stalin aged, his paranoia intensified. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, he was convinced of new conspiracies constantly. The Doctor's plot of 1952 to 1953 was particularly deranged. Stalin became convinced that mostly Jewish doctors were plotting to poison Soviet leaders. He ordered arrests and torture, extracted confessions, and was apparently planning another massive purge when he died. This late-stage paranoia was partly strategic. Another purge would have reinforced his control. But it also seemed genuinely pathological. Stalin was seeing conspiracies that didn't exist, suspecting people who'd served him loyally for decades. His death in March 1953 may have saved thousands of lives. The purge he was planning never happened. His paranoia literally died with him. Did Stalin enjoy his life? It's hard to say. He worked constantly, trusted no one, lived in fear of assassination. He had power beyond measure but seemed unable to find pleasure in it. He liked movies, watched them almost nightly. He enjoyed Georgian food and wine, though he ate simply and drank moderately by Russian standards. He liked gardening at his dacha, growing lemons and roses, but even his leisure seemed joyless. He watched movies alone or with terrified subordinates. He ate in silence or while working. His gardening was meticulous and controlled. Like everything else, Stalin created a prison for everyone, but he also created one for himself. He couldn't trust anyone, couldn't relax, couldn't ever feel safe. The paranoia that let him maintain absolute power also made that power a burden. Did Stalin know what he was? Did he see himself as a monster? Probably not. Stalin seemed to genuinely believe he was building socialism, defending the Soviet Union, serving historical necessity. The people he killed were traitors, saboteurs, enemies. The terror was regrettable but necessary. This self-justification was probably sincere. Stalin wasn't cackling over his evil. He was doing what had to be done, in his mind. The suffering of millions was unfortunate but irrelevant compared to the historical importance of his goals. This might be more disturbing than if he'd known he was evil. Stalin represents how people can commit atrocities while believing they're righteous. He shows how ideology can justify any cruelty, how power can corrupt someone into believing their own propaganda. So what was Joseph Stalin actually like as a person? He was paranoid to a pathological degree, seeing enemies everywhere, trusting no one, remembering every slight and settling every score. He had virtually no capacity for empathy. People were objects to him, tools or threats, but never fellow humans deserving of consideration. He was extraordinarily patient when pursuing long-term goals but impulsively cruel in personal interactions. He needed absolute control over everything and everyone, micromanaging absurdly while building a cult of personality around himself. He worked obsessively, kept bizarre hours deliberately designed to exhaust subordinates, and used social situations as psychological torture sessions. He had a dark, cruel sense of humor and found amusement in others' fear. He was intelligent but rigid, strategic but vindictive, methodical in planning mass murder but capable of impulsive decisions that doomed individuals on a whim. He was cold toward his own family, destroyed everyone who got close to him, and seemed incapable of genuine human connection. He built an empire of terror where reality itself was unstable, where truth was whatever he declared it to be, where millions died because Stalin signed lists of names the way most people sign grocery receipts. Understanding Stalin's personality doesn't make his crimes more comprehensible. It makes them more disturbing. Because it shows that mass murder doesn't require an incomprehensible monster. It requires a person with certain personality traits, paranoia, absence of empathy, need for control, patience, ruthlessness, combined with absolute power and an ideology that justifies any atrocity. Stalin wasn't born a monster. His abusive childhood contributed, his experiences as a revolutionary shaped him, the Bolshevik culture of violence enabled him. But at some point, probably gradually, Joseph Dugashvili became something inhuman, someone who could sign death warrants over breakfast, watch movies at night, and sleep soundly. The man who grew lemons and watched westerns also murdered millions. Both are real. Understanding that doesn't excuse it or explain it away. It just shows us what humans are capable of becoming when empathy dies, when power has no limits, and when ideology provides justification for any cruelty. That's who Joseph Stalin was. Not a devil. Not a force of nature. A human being who made choices, over and over, for decades, to value power over life, control over humanity, and his own paranoid fantasies over the suffering of millions. And the most terrifying lesson is this: the personality traits that made Stalin so monstrous, paranoia, lack of empathy, need for control, patient ruthlessness, exist on a spectrum in many people. It's the combination with absolute power and enabling ideology that creates catastrophe. Stalin shows us that evil isn't always exotic or incomprehensible. Sometimes it's just certain human traits, taken to extremes, freed from all constraints, and given the power to remake reality according to its distorted vision.